Hello, heathens. I'm Wyld Violet,
And I'm Transvangelical.
and this is Not Safe for Worship. Here, we talk about the ethics of sex work and sexuality in general through the lens of post-religious trauma. These are deeply personal topics for us, and we strive to delve in with humor and respect, but we do discuss very sensitive and potentially triggering subjects on a regular basis. Please practice self-care and compassion. Take breaks or even stop listening if you need to. We care deeply about you and your well-being. You're listening to Not Safe for Worship.
The podcast where we talk about growing up conservative and religious and then later became sex workers.
It's the ideal arc, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's the pipeline that everyone should actually want.
Well,
I went from like preaching about the evils of porn to youth groups to making porn. So that's a pipeline.
It's so true. It's so true, and delightful for those of us who can make it all the way here. But even for those who never get into sex work, as long as you make it out of the purity culture, we salute you, and we're here to support you. So we're going to be talking about all kinds of different topics that, especially if you're someone who's deconverting or trying to adjust your faith to keep up with your sexuality, probably some stuff that you're wrestling with. Today, we kind of want to look at the concept of modesty and virginity. I don't know about y'all, but when I deconverted, I started dressing differently eventually. Like, oh, it's really hot outside, so maybe it's okay to show my shoulders because I'm sweating my ass off. And I know that a lot of us kind of had to wrestle with that idea, and also the idea, virginity sticks in our heads as this like sex is supposed to be a kind of a limited resource, right? We only give it to one person, and now we're dealing with like, what does it look like to be ethically slutty? So we're gonna look at that. We're gonna look at modesty and virginity and how it fucked us all up.
And this episode isn't going to be prescriptive of how you should deal with these concepts. Just, I don't know, I guess kind of giving permission to let you figure out what's good for you. Because it is actually really a complicated subject, because we're not just dealing with the idea of modesty and the idea of stumbling blocks. We are actually, in a way, talking about safety and a world that blames women for sexual assault, for how they dress, and um being cognizant of the fact that exists, even though it's not it's not women's fault. But yeah, like you get to choose like what you get to wear, and you get to make that choice based off of the world you live and how you feel and the values that you have. But we're just going to kind of talk about some of the some of the reasons we were taught the things we were taught, and some of the kind of how like messed up a lot of that logic was.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and really, there is so much here, ethically, culturally.
we live in a complicated world that has complicated and rather problematic understandings of, especially the female body. It's not as complicated for the male body for some reason. Like, I don't know,
And perhaps another important disclaimer here is that, uh, the perspectives that we're giving are also going to be kind of unique. You're going to hear me talk about what I learned about modesty and virginity growing up as, a cis girl. And then, Alicia can share a little bit of a different experience. But as, from her growing up years, but then, as adults, I think we're facing a lot of the same backlash as sex workers, and once again, those experiences just really lining up. So if you hear things in here that don't reflect you, understandable. We all have different journeys, but let's unpack. So I want to know a little bit about what you were taught about modesty on your side of things. I know what I was hearing, and it was gross. But.
the male version of modesty was, we didn't have it. It didn't exist. Like, I think that we relied a lot on the American idea that, like, a man in a Speedo is, uncomfortable and, like, comedic, not sexual, um, and because, like, a man in a Speedo is considered non-sexual, like, you can really only go up from there. So, basically, "Don't be naked" was really what we were
Literally.
told. Yeah,
Yeah, just
but it
like,
was
don't take out your penis.
yeah, which is a good rule.
It is a
Let's
great rule.
acknowledge the fact that, that at least evangelicalism taught men to not just take out their penises. They didn't quite get to the without consent part, but, they got almost halfway there or
At least in
something.
public, I mean, we'll give
Yeah,
them, like, 1/16th of a point for that, I guess.
yeah.
And
But
of
it's
course,
so
of course, like, I was not being taught, like, "Well, just don't take out your tits and everything will be fine." Not the messaging I got.
Yeah, I'm
It's
sure.
wild.
Um, Something that's really interesting is, like, how much I did internalize the female modesty, talks because, like, whenever I was first talking with a therapist, like, when I was coming out as trans and realizing it, working through a lot of things, my therapist asked me, like, um do you think that one of these days you're gonna be just running and going on a run in a sports bra and shorts? And I laughed because I thought it was ridiculous because, like, of course, I'm not just gonna run in a sports bra. And, like, uh, it caught me so off guard because I didn't realize that I had actually internalized modesty standards, being raised to be male. So, like, yeah, I did it was kind of eye-opening how much that was imparted on me, like, without actually knowing on my side. I have now ran in just a sports bra and shirt, but when I was first, like, just talking about it, um, it was just weird to realize that it was internalized that much.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. You always been you. You know, this is kind of an interesting segue for anyone who's listening, maybe that didn't grow up with these standards, if you're out there. This might sound pretty extreme, like the idea that running in a sports bra could somehow be scandalous, right? But actually, you're just giving me a great segue into a great story. Just a few weeks ago, I went to do an exchange with my ex-husband. And when I showed up to do this exchange, we met in a public parking lot for, I don't know, 30 seconds. I was wearing a pair of like short shorts. They were like kind of cotton shorts. And I was wearing a crop top with it. It was real hot outside and I had just come from the river. I had the day off. And I got a text from him after we left requesting that I not wear my underwear because his other children, his stepchildren in the car, like they're trying to teach them that, you don't show your underwear in public. Like that's not appropriate. And they were just really confused by the fact that I showed up in my underwear. Apparently, the assumption was that I was wearing a sports bra. I had to prove that it was a crop top, which I'm not sure why that matters. They're relatively similar, but this one had a lot more like shoulder, clavicle, back coverage.
Mhm.
And so this conversation for me, God, it was so interesting to try and figure out how to engage this because I was just like, I'm first of all, I'm not in my underwear. Like, second of all, what you can't control everything that your child sees, and the idea that they're going to be so confused if they see someone running in a sports bra. Why? Why?
Yeah.
Why is my stomach going to be offensive or confusing to them? Well, because we're trying to teach them that, you don't just wear your underwear in public. Well, okay. Tell them, first of all, that I wasn't in my underwear and I was probably wearing it because I was hot outside. Like, that's the answer to the why question because it's hot outside.
Yeah.
And, and basically, it comes down to, um, the idea that children couldn't possibly understand that there are various circumstances where various things are appropriate. And like, no, I'm not going to wear my sports bra to like a formal work event. But if I'm going on a jog in the heat, why is it scandalous? Only if you're sexualizing me. Only if
Mhm.
you're looking at me as as an object. Only if you're assuming that these parts of my body are somehow indecent by
Yeah.
nature. And interestingly enough, if you ask an evangelical, your belly button is probably indecent. This is a an almost 35-year-old man we're talking about who has been moving through this world and lives in this modern era. And rather than tell his kid, that's not underwear, she's probably hot, she came from the river, it was, could you please not show your tummy in front of my stepkid? That's confusing.
Yeah, and it's like part of that is kind of why we need to talk about modesty in such a way because it's not just uh, it, it's not just a simple fact that it's our culture that's our cultural standards. Like it's that it's being passed down, and it's intentionally being passed down in a way that sexualizes specifically feminine bodies. We still like we still don't live in a world where
Yeah.
there's like equality of bodies,
Let's think about the
and
ramifications of that answer.
yeah,
That he's if you're saying to that child, yeah, you know, she's out here in her underwear and that's not appropriate and I don't know why she's doing that. I mean, what's the implication for how he looks at the women around him that he sees in sports bras forever? Like,
yeah,
oh, she's dressed in a way that's inappropriate. She's doing
like
something wrong. And
what what's he
now what?
gonna what's he gonna think when he watches beach volleyball in the Olympics this summer? Like that's their actual uniform. Granted, we can maybe talk about that a little bit more because the
Mhm.
Olympics have actually made rules to make their I don't want to use immodest, like make the uniforms for some women's sports more revealing, like
Smaller than they
having
need to
yeah,
be.
yeah, which is which
Smaller
is
than they're
weird,
probably is probably comfortable for the
like
athletes, like,
yeah,
because that's kind of the point.
because that's also not okay, like, it's not in that to
No.
me, it's not a modesty thing, it's like, you really like, we shouldn't be making rules on what people are comfortable wearing,
Right.
like,
What
for
is
for
the idea
me
of modesty though at the root?
yeah,
It's the idea that people should be dressed in a certain way that is pleasing
mhm,
to me, and whether that means more covered up because I'm kind of puritanical on the inside and I can't look at you without like having really uncomfortable thoughts that
yeah,
make me
yeah,
angry, or it can be, you know, the other direction. I want you to wear this for my pleasure, whether it's comfortable for you or not.
yeah,
And so it really is an issue of control and power, and an issue of wanting people to present in a way that makes you feel good, as though that's other people's purpose
mhm.
as far as their aesthetics.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. Why don't we do like a history lesson of where westernized modesty comes from?
Yes, please.
And I didn't give Vi a heads up on this beforehand. Uh, but yeah, so let's talk about it because a lot of our understanding of sexuality, of modesty, all those things come from Christian ideologies that
Hmm.
are ultimately kind of based in really outdated traditions. Uh, it- Most of the ancient Middle East required higher level women to be virgins, because it was because marriage was a contract between two different families that would then
Hmm.
create unity between the families. They would then, be more likely work together, defend each other,
Hmm.
that type of thing. And the idea was that women belonged to their father, and then when they got married, they belonged to their husband, and that bond of marriage was not necessarily between a man and a woman. It was between a man's family and a woman's family to really to help each other survive in their society, which in a way isn't the worst thing. Like survival isn't terrible, but like it's kind of a messed up idea of ownership.
The fact
Um,
that the woman's survival was dependent on it is what's screwed up too,
yeah, it's
because,
very messed up.
if you've ever watched, these shows about, royals and the ruling class and stuff, you'll see
Hmm.
sometimes that ritual where,
Hmm.
people
Definitely.
will come into their bedchamber on the wedding night to observe and make sure that the woman bled in order to ensure that she was a virgin. And so the
Yeah.
understanding in, kind of ancient history is that, like, once you have had sex, you're essentially as good as married or used,
Hmm.
and then you're not going to marry someone else. You're not, if you're not a quote unquote virgin, if you're not unspoiled, then you can't do that. And so my understanding, of the and of course the Western stuff that we're going to get into is so different from this, but my understanding of, like, the ancient concept of virginity and the way that it was talked about in scripture even was, if you have sex with a woman, now you need to marry her,
Hmm.
because she won't be able to marry anyone else. She won't be
Yeah.
able to live in a patriarchal society. She won't be able to function. And so when, men were commanded not to do this, it was actually, if you're going to have sex, so this idea of, like, if you're going to have sex, get married, right?
Yeah.
Where we get a lot of our ideas about virginity and purity in the culture. If you're in the church, if you're going to have sex, get married was actually a protective measure for these women.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of part of that is because of the need for the family bonds, you couldn't there couldn't be any doubt that uh children were from somebody's line, because you needed the line to be protected. And so the virginity of women became kind of that like ability to know that any child that she has belongs to this man, thus his lineage is intact, and it ensures survival of the lineage. It's also why adultery was met with execution, because it messed with that, it messed with that certainty of maintaining lineage. Because if a woman is sleeping around, you don't know who is the actual father, right? Um, but also because of that, like this is why there's restrictions on the number of husbands a woman can have, but not number of wives, which is why we see multiple people in the Bible having multiple wives, is because the point was to maintain a man's lineage, not
We have
not
been controlling and
yeah.
commodifying women's womb since the beginning of time,
Oh,
people.
yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, that's why there's, like, that passage, about inducing an abortion if a woman is suspected of adultery. Like, they make this little concoction and uh, either she loses the baby, and that means that, that she had an affair, but if she keeps the baby, then it's the man's child. Like, it's terrible. It is actually terrible. But, like, this is
Paternity testing,
yeah,
but
really,
worse.
but worse, and also needing, like, an aspect of the supernatural to work, which is I don't know, it's yeah. Um,
Just
but
pray
yeah,
about it.
abortion was in the Bible. And
Well, we're gonna have to get into that in another
we'll
episode.
get into that at some point, I'm
Damn,
sure.
just dropping that.
Yeah. Uh But yeah, like that idea of the propertyhood of women is so entrenched in that culture. Um, and then like that's kind of the foundation that we have going into the New Testament. But then the New Testament becomes very Greek and Roman in their understanding of sexuality and men and women, where almost in women are almost entirely unimportant. Like they still maintain the propertyhood, but like this is it's kind of why Jesus was so against divorce, was because in the culture of the first century, men could just divorce a woman, and then she's really kind of out of luck. Like,
Mhm.
there's nothing for her to do. Um,
She
so yeah,
can't be
like
educated, she can't just go get a job and sustain a successful career, she can't I
yeah,
mean, yeah, she's in trouble.
she's in trouble. But still, she's still property, and like because she's property, she has to maintain her purity. We'll throw that word out there. Um, because purity should not have anything to do with sexuality. It literally means like unblemished. Your your value should not come from like whether or not you've had sex. Um,
Well,
but
and
like in
in
that,
that framework, theoretically, now correct me if
yeah,
I'm wrong, but, like, subsequent sexual encounters would not mean that you were becoming more and more impure and that you were sinning and sinning and sinning. It would just be like, you're either impure like, you're either unblemished or you're blemished, and you're either suited for marriage or you're not, and this is,
mhm.
like this has a lot more to do with family than it does with the fact that you're having sex for fun.
Yeah, it's completely connected to family.
Mhm.
Like because that's what women were in ancient cultures was
Family
something
builders.
something yeah, something to be given to another man to it's kind the family ties thing isn't as important in the first century as what it was for tribal Canaanite uh people groups just because the type of civilization that was building up um but still like patriarchy still put men over women
Mhm.
and women still needed to be like these things where only one man touches them. uh,
Yeah.
However, like if you're a slave like that, that's thrown out the window. You don't have value anyways. And so like
Mm-mm.
slave women, which in the first century, uh, I think it's like one third of the entire population were slaves, which is a lot. um,
You can do whatever
yeah,
you want
they didn't. Yeah, they
with an
didn't have value. They
enslaved
could be
person.
raped.
They just
Yeah,
yep.
and it didn't matter.
You
Uh,
can I believe, as I understand it, they could also be trafficked.
yeah,
It was kind of frowned upon for a head of a household to be trafficking out, the enslaved women in his household, to an extent, but it was also very much allowed.
yeah,
Um, so I think basically what I'm hearing, at its core, the origin story really of the concept of virginity is this is a patriarchal construct that was put in place to preserve a man's lineage and
mhm,
ensure like control of a woman by her family.
yeah,
Ensure that
and
she did not have options outside of complying to the patriarchal structure that was put in place, you know?
yeah. And it's like we kind of see the echoes of this in purity culture from like we talked about this in the preview episode where it's kind of this idea that when before you're married you're still kind of married to your future spouse in a way, so you have to
Mhm,
like remain holy for your future spouse because they own you. Like they own you from eternity after and eternity before,
mhm,
and that really comes from these ideas of women belong to their fathers until they're married and then they belong to their husbands, and it's this idea that they never maintain have ownership of their bodies. And um, modern times, we kind of throw that towards men every once in a while, not as much as for women, but yeah, that's like the echoes of it still persist today in that idea.
mhm.
Um, so yeah, but once Christianity started, and there's like this brief,
And
maybe
today,
50.
you know what I just realized?
What's that?
Today we frame it as a matter of faithfulness to God, to the family of God,
Hmm.
and to our it's like we're honoring our Christian beliefs, by submitting. Um, and so once again, emphasis on maybe a different kind of family. But again, again, just a lot of control
Yeah, it
issues.
yeah, it definitely is. Um, yeah, there like I was saying, there was like, I don't know, 50 to maybe 100 years when Christianity first started where Christianity actually was very feminist um like they let women become pastors and speaker. Pastor wasn't really a position back then. The idea of the modern pastor is not first century Christianity. Um, but women were like women were leaders. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it- Women wanted Christian husbands because the church actually spoke against things like marital rape. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and they would one thing that got them in trouble with Rome was like the fact that uh in Rome if a wealthy person had an affair with like raped a slave, really that's what we're talking about. They would force them to what's called expose the child, which is basically they give birth and then they go put it in a field and let it die.
Yeah.
Um
Oh God.
yeah, so like this is still the Uh, but the church would go and find the child and then raise them. They really kind of started some of the first orphanages, and that made Rome kind of really mad because Rome didn't actually want the children to live. Every once in a while, there would be people
Contaminate the
that would,
bloodlines.
yeah, I mean, because if you don't know your parents, like you don't have a genealogy per se, so you don't necessarily have standing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then like the church would try to ensure that they did. So it was very countercultural. Like it's not a bad thing. Like very recent post Jesus type Christianity is not bad. uh, but by the time we hit like 150 to 200 uh, CE time frame, like Christianity started to become Romanized, and then by the time Constantine becomes emperor and makes Christianity like legal, um like we have to understand we have to understand Constantine did not change Christianity. Christianity changed to where Constantine was okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a quick change. So Christianity became very Romanized very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, uh, imparted um the Roman view of women back into the church. So really, there's only about 100 years at the most in Christian history where they like tried to give women like almost equality. It still wasn't, but it was better. Like it was at least kind of on the right path.
They
Um,
were making moves.
yeah, they were making moves. That's not me saying yeah we just need to get back to the original Christianity. No, like I said before, like I like Jesus and there's reasons. One of them is because he was kind of progressive on women.
Mm-hmm.
But like that doesn't excuse the church. Like,
No,
you do
no.
not have to go back to Christianity just because it started out right. Like
Yeah, absolutely.
you don't have to keep going to McDonald's because when they first started their ice cream machines worked. Like no, you know, you
I love that.
uh, but yeah, like once it became Romanized again, like women went back to being the property of women of their fathers and then their husbands. Um, and then they became very hyper. Like I'm not. I want to say it's more the Victorian era. So we're jumping like 1500 years here, um, where the modern idea of modesty really comes into play because that's whenever the idea of these lavish garments and things come into play, or being rich means you cover up a lot. And so hiding your body becomes kind of this symbol of being rich.
You can accessorize.
Yeah, you
You've
can.
got the hats, you've got the collars, you've got frills, you've got 3 different petticoats. I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
really know
I
what
mean,
they
you got a
exactly.
corset, you get one of those, like,
Yeah.
uh, I don't know, what do you call those, like, frames that keep your dress all poofy?
Right,
Like
oh my god, those are h could you even sit? But the idea is, of course, that those clothes mean that you really are the people that can sit,
yeah,
because if you
yeah,
need to be, one of the laboring class, doing, manual work, then you can't wear a corset and a giant poofy
yeah, of
skirt.
course.
So I
It
imagine it becomes, a bit looked down upon to be more scantily clad, not because someone might be lusting after you, but because the more scantily you are clad, the more weather you must be enduring, and the more work, and the more
mhm,
and the lower class you must not be able to afford more garments, etc., etc.
yeah, and what's interesting is, like, when modesty is talked about in the Bible, and, like, the words get translated modesty, like, it's actually about highlighting your wealth and not showing off your body. So, like, the Victorian era actually redefined modesty to be exactly opposite of what the modesty in the Bible was talking about, which is ironic. It's a very European thing to be like, nope, we're gonna redefine this.
We're gonna turn this on its head in the name of Jesus.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so like that's really where the idea of modesty as far as clothing, like being naked was never socially acceptable, but for a long time it was seen as shameful, not not something that causes lust. Like it's a very different concept
No,
of nakedness.
I think I think of like bathhouses in
Yeah.
like, the ancient Roman culture. So there were places where it was socially acceptable to walk around
Mhm.
nude in front of
Well,
others
for men.
for men, and
Yeah.
that, of course, their bodies weren't seen as sexual in that context. Now, those places didn't exist for women.
Uh, um, you know, I there were places that had female bathhouses that were segregated from men's. Yeah, generally women wouldn't be allowed in bathhouses unless it was specific for women.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, that was a little bit different. But if like somebody was naked in the street, like that was shameful. That wasn't sexual.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah. So like the concept of showing off parts of your body, like uh, was something that was developed later. And now we're not gonna talk about like Islam and how like covering up became a thing there. That's not our tradition. We don't talk we don't talk outside of our tradition in that sense.
We could get into so many different there are religions and denominations, and
Yeah,
so many different views on this. Of course, again, with that disclaimer that these are our opinions and our
yeah.
experiences, but yeah.
And it wouldn't be right for us to talk about somebody else's tradition. There's people out there doing it. So
Yeah.
hopefully, like if you want to learn more about that stuff, you're gonna have to find somebody that comes from that tradition.
And they
Um,
actually know what they're talking about.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not.
absolutely.
I don't think that I am
Yeah,
more educated than someone who lives it. So
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just, gosh. So in Western culture, then we're saying it really kind of evolved more as a status symbol.
definitely.
Um, kind of it was like, when I was in high school, you were cool only if you were wearing Abercrombie and Fitch. But like
Yeah,
back then, you were cool like only if you were covered up and you had a hoop skirt.
yeah, exactly.
Got it.
That's yeah. Um, but yeah, that became like so normalized in European culture that it it became the understanding that this was the correct way to view bodies, to view um interpersonal relationships between men and women. But because of that concept of a woman still belongs to a man, um,
Mhm.
that meant, like, the sexual parts of a woman were only meant to be seen by a man that she was married to,
Mhm.
and that man was the only person who's entitled to see those parts. So then
Mm.
that's kind of where the idea of
But it
within
was
purity
always
culture.
more about power and control
Mhm.
and about, like, money and status than it ever
Yeah,
was about lust or pleasure or
yeah.
any of the things that we're talking about today when people use words like virginity and modesty. And obviously, we haven't we still have so many echoes of that Victorian culture. Like it's
Mhm.
still ingrained in so many places. And then we also still have this idea, I think kind of a lot of people do anyway, that this is a Christian nation. And so overarchingly, we want to apply these ideas to, dress codes and ancient ideas, right?
Yeah.
But I do also, it's interesting. There was a movement. There has been a movement, obviously, since the Victorian era, and I feel like Hugh Hefner, as much of a shit as he was really influential in that. When I think about
I mean, that's
Marilyn
post.
Monroe coming on the scene.
Yeah,
This is all like so recent, but I think about
yeah,
all of that and the way that these people kind of took back the concept, and it's like we can show off our bodies and people can enjoy them, and we can do this for sexual purposes, and maybe that's not the main issue. Now, of course, the way that he did it, he didn't get to the main issues, right, which were
yeah,
actually about consent and about empowering people to display their bodies in ways that are comfortable for them. And I think that's kind of there we are moving into when we're talking about ethical sex work. So
yeah. Yep,
it's
like,
gosh,
Hugh Hefner, one of the things that he did, like, he kind of had the start of a good idea, but really
he
what he
did, and then he
sold
tanked it.
what he ended up selling was you can have access to a woman's body that isn't your spouse. And that's really what he was selling more than
Hmm.
anything, which is not that's still not the right framing.
No,
Uh,
it's not. It's not. I
yeah,
th- I think about women. Well, I just think about like the first issue and Marilyn Monroe and how
yeah,
influential and just and he started with this publication, which in the beginning, as I understand it, like you said, being able to see someone that wasn't their wife, but also allowing women to kind of step outside of whatever box they'd been put in, these celebrities
mhm,
that could say like, oh, I want to do this too, and this is, I
yeah,
have the potential here. I think that it would have been great if it had been just that. Of course, then exploitation always
yeah,
becomes the name of the game, and God, we could go into so many pieces with that. Well, maybe we don't all know how terrible that franchise,
yeah, it was
how they treated their models in the end. It
yeah,
just ended up having the opposite effect on the industry because they did not empower the models.
yeah,
They did not do it ethically. They did not prioritize their comfort uh, or anything else. So, and
mhm,
anyway,
and there's
now
reports
we're
of
kind of, I feel like we did like a giant, I feel like there've been some
yeah,
kind of giant swings, I guess is what I'm looking at. We had that
yeah, yeah,
Victorian era thing, and then I feel like we kind of started to just like come out of it, and then we went bam, like Hugh Hefner era. We swung the other direction so hard, but to objectifying and to commodifying. And there's this huge, not huge, I guess. There's kind of the beginning of this movement over the past few years to take that
to take it
back,
back.
for
Yeah,
women to take power over their own
yeah.
content creation back and be like, you know what, that was a great idea to give us a platform, but you fucked it up. So now we're gonna
So
we're
now
gonna
we
do our
have to
own
do it.
thing. If you want something done right,
Yeah, yeah. Well,
you got to
so a
get
lot of
naked
that
yourself.
yeah, a lot of that, what kind of laid the groundwork for all of that was actually, um, mm, encountering other cultures and then racist understandings of other cultures. So like in the Victorian period, like every part of a woman's body belongs to her future husband. She can't show off her ankles or whatever until she's married, and then only her husband can see her uh, undressed because her body belongs to him, right? And,
Yeah.
and that became the status quo until Europe is like, you know what, we could colonize places, and they started showing up in like Africa and the Americas, and they encountered cultures that did not
Mhm.
have the same understanding. And because of that, they wouldn't dress in the European understanding of modest. They were
Mhm.
most people, most cultures dress functionally, not as a display of wealth and superiority. So they encountered these other cultures, and their women weren't covering up, and that created this narrative of being sexually deviant within these other cultures, which then led to the narrative that they needed
God.
Jesus, which led to to
So
missionaries being sent there.
yeah,
Uh,
modesty is deeply intertwined then with things like, crusading, cultural
mhm.
erasure, wow, and, there was something else you said that struck me, and now I can't I'll try to rewind it in my
That's
brain and
okay.
come back to
Um,
it.
a book that like goes into it
Oh,
really
and
well
othering,
is
with the
yeah, the
the
othering. Yeah,
othering of the native peoples and
yeah,
really, again, like a wrestling away of power almost, just
yeah.
God.
Um, and so like indigenous peoples were basically genocided to follow European standards. Uh,
Mm, yeah.
People from Africa were enslaved and then forced into European standards, but then still, because black women were being enslaved, they were still wearing more functional clothes, so they weren't dressed up as quote modest like the white women. And
Always the distinction. Capitalism.
yeah,
Modesty is
yeah,
so wrapped up in capitalism,
so much.
racism,
Yeah,
patriarchy, literally everything. It's just
I,
it's wild when you start talking about these concepts, the way that you can see them permeating so
yeah.
many aspects of our lives that we don't even think about.
It's why intersectionality is so important, is
So
because
important.
all of these things are actually interconnected.
Mhm.
But because of like this idea that like black women were more immodest, it led to this idea of the black seductress, and thus white men couldn't help themselves uh, to to say no to black women, and so they had an out to rape their slaves. And this is this is kind of why you'll have last like I have a last name that outside of my family is predominantly black people. It's because I come from the South. And my ancestors raped slaves, and that's why
Ugh.
there are so many black people with the same last name as me. Uh, because there was this narrative that like if a slave woman is raped, it's her fault. She wasn't dressed up. She was working the fields and something that showed her arms or whatever.
Well, and also, kind of like within marriage, just this idea that, like, it doesn't really matter whose fault it was. He had an urge and it was his right. Like, yeah,
Especially in power dynamics of antebellum America, is like white man with money, like he gets to do whatever. Like,
whatever
uh,
he wants.
yeah, and really no one could stop him unless he did something to another white person. Uh, which so like if a white man raped a white woman, there could be problems, but he could rape a black woman, and there's absolutely
Right.
nothing that could be done.
And it's really interesting that they frame it then as like, well, we can't control ourselves, so we have to have this outlet. But like, they're controlling themselves around the white women. This is just an excuse to not have to control yourself. That's
Yeah,
what you're that mhm.
and so
What you're
like a lot
saying
of
is you're a piece of shit and you believe that some humans deserve more respect than others.
basically, or I mean, it still kind of goes into, well, I still do own her, right?
Yep.
And so it plays into ownership and this idea that if a man is able to have sex with a woman, like it's not necessarily his fault because it's his property. Um, and this is where
There
a
is
lot
no
of
fault.
Western,
There
yeah,
is
there's
no
no fault.
fault in it unless something goes wrong, then it's her fault.
Yeah. And this is kind of where the idea of Western modesty being a sexual temptation really grabbed hold, was the idea that black women were too tempting to white men.
Which is a dynamic they set up.
Yeah, yeah, it totally is. Um, and like somebody who goes into this like super deep is uh Kelly Brown Douglas, dang it, or maybe it's Kelly Douglas Brown. You can find it. The book is Sexuality in the Black Church. You don't have to be Christian or whatever to read it. It is still one of the like biggest framings of like coming out of purity culture to like help me understand how the idea of modesty and virginity is very much tied to racism within the United States and how we
Mm,
view the sexuality of non-white people. Like
that
it's
sounds
very interconnected.
yeah. Well, that book sounds brilliant. I did a quick Google search. It is Kelly Brown Douglas. So,
There we go.
Sexuality in the Black Church, a Womanist Perspective. I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to
It
download that too.
it's an amazing book. And it'll talk about how like queerness, I don't know if she uses the term queerness, but I'm going to use that as a umbrella term, is um very common in basically other groups that aren't white. But white people have essentially tried to cleanse the earth of queerness, uh,
Mm.
which we see that in the genocide of indigenous people. We see that
Mhm.
in the way that we treated slaves, and in a lot of ways, how we understand queerness in the world today within our white cultures is actually how it was expressed uh, in is actually the way that it was expressed by black people coming out of slavery or even within slavery, and how they found a way to exist in the world. And then once white people started to be okay with their queerness, uh, we kind of appropriated it uh, from
Whoa.
black people, which is not a topic that a lot of people want to talk about, because the truth is white people don't have a tradition of queerness, and so we either have to make it up or take it from somebody, and kind of let we kind of let black people lead the way, and then we took it and copied them. But
I do wanna talk about that.
yeah. uh, I mean, yeah. I feel like this needs to be like an entire episode, but we can spend a little time talking about it right now, especially since
We should
it's
absolutely make
June and it's Pride Month
that an
right now when
episode.
we're recording.
Yeah. Well, and so, gosh, as a later bloomer, I realize that I still have a lot of homework to do.
Yeah.
And this is fascinating to me. I would love to do the research. I'll admit that I'm relatively ignorant about where the elements of white pride came from, to be honest with you. But of
I
course, we
mean,
appropriated it. How could
yeah,
I
of
not
course.
know
I
that?
mean, black drags existed before white drag, even though I think a lot of times the drag queens that get the most like time on TV are white. Um,
Yup.
Unless maybe like RuPaul, I think that's a little bit better. But like you watch something like Happiest Season, it's a white drag queen. It
Mhm.
like drag is a black tradition.
Wow.
It's not ours. um, in that I don't want to say that like we shouldn't express our queerness in ways that other people have, because I do actually think that kind of in spite of our supremacy type things, other cultures have allowed us to join with them in expressions of queerness, which I think is something that us as white queer people need to recognize and have a lot more respect about, especially whenever we whitewash pride so often. It's yeah.
I
We
think I think
we
one of
owe
the
pride
things
to Black people
absolute
and
I'm
Indigenous
whew,
people and people of color.
I think that oh my gosh. Wow. Okay, you're blowing my mind a little bit. I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know more about this topic. I haven't, um, to be honest with you. I love drag, but I've only really been to a couple of shows and haven't looked into the origins. And I gotta say, I one of my favorite things about being out as queer is the way that other queers relate to me in the wild. And it doesn't
Mhm.
seem to necessarily matter so much social standing or race, or there's this kind of common connection
Yeah,
over the understanding of the way that we have to move through the world. And that's really, really beautiful. And I am really so grateful to understand that it's been other cultures that have invited us into that. um Jesus, what a gift. And I also think, like you said, if we are joining in
yeah,
these celebrations of pride, then that's exactly what we should be doing, is joining in and coming alongside and centering, the people who gave us these traditions. So
yeah, absolutely.
really interesting research that I need to do.
Yeah. But anyways, we're talking about modesty and
Yeah,
virginity. We'll explore that one in like a full episode, and I think that we'll probably need to try to find somebody that's more of an expert on the topic, which would be fun.
absolutely. Yeah, that'd be
Um,
great.
but yeah, our understanding of modesty within especially the United States is so entrenched in racism, and the idea of propertyhood of women and how that got reinforced during slavery and segregation. Uh, but also like the purity culture that we grew up in, because we grew up in like that 90s purity culture, was a response to Reagan era white Christian nationalism, that created this idea of kind of the welfare, the welfare mom, or whatever the term was. But really, like, it used a racist understanding that black mothers took more from the government than white mothers, and so purity culture of the 90s was really a response of like, let's make sure our white children don't end up like these black children in having babies outside of marriage and then being taking a toll on our government. So
Ugh.
if you were raised in 90s 2000 purity culture, like, it's a direct result of Reagan era uh,
Mhm.
racism and dog whistles,
Ugh.
which is something that I don't think is talked about quite enough. Is like,
Reagan really fucked us up.
yeah,
I mean, who plenty of people have, but that
yeah,
was an era.
Reagan tried to genocide queer people. Is he intentionally ignored AIDS because it was only affecting
Mhm.
the LGBTQ plus community,
He
and
I think he also would have preferred, if that all, people of color were just, imprisoned.
yeah, yeah, and he kind of tried to do that. Um,
Mhm. He absolutely did.
yeah,
Which yeah, yeah. Oh, I could just start talking. But anyway,
yeah,
yeah, this
so,
is so interesting, the way that it does all trickle down, and that it all comes from toxic ideas, but it's pushed in this, this is the family ideal, and this is how you have the perfect little, you know
mhm,
marriage and life, essentially. Be pure, be demure, be the Proverbs
yeah,
31 woman.
yeah. We'll
God,
talk about that one later because
oh
that's
good.
misunderstood.
100%. But it gets used against
Yeah.
women all the time. Um,
But I do like I want to talk about us and coming out of that because at least for me, getting into like making adult content was kind of a response of um stepping into a feminine like living as female in the world around us. Not that I wasn't a woman before I transitioned per se, but I wasn't perceived and treated like one. Um
mhm,
And for me, making adult content became kind of an outlet for me to really connect some of it helped me reclaim my body in a lot of ways because I felt disconnected from my body because of being trans and being socialized male. I felt disconnected from sexuality because I was raised in purity culture and creating adult content really became this like means to explore my own sexuality, to explore my own body in a way where I set the rules. And like nobody was telling me what I could or could not do. And I could make the rules and be like, no, this person's not getting content. Like
mhm.
I've not really had to do that very often. I most people have been very respectful, but like it is known that like my content is part of my body and I get to choose. And to me it's such a liberating way of reclaiming my body. It's not for everyone. Obviously, I won't say that right now. It's not for everyone, but for me that was like a huge draw of starting it.
Absolutely. I, gosh, don't know how to address that without being real personal. So, I was married to a man for a really long time, and when I got married, I actually was a virgin. Um, and so when we there was actually a short stint when I was doing some online creation while we were still together, but very much with his permission. And then after a time, it was like maybe 6 months, stopped doing that. Um, and then after my divorce, coming back to it, for me, it is. It's so liberating and so empowering because for my entire life, right, I had been told that I was supposed to be saving it for this man, that this was the only experience I was going to have, that this was the right way to do things, the only ethical way to have sex. And that when I got married, if I had saved myself, then the sex would be so good, my relationship would be so blessed, all these things. My marriage crumbled and I figured out that I'm gay. And at the time when I figured it out, the level of guilt over feeling like I had duped someone, right? Like I
Mhm.
had promised this person forever without knowing this about myself, but I couldn't possibly have known because I had had no sexual interaction with anyone but him until our wedding night. And I was taught to just believe that I was going to get married and have a white picket fence, and like suddenly all of the stuff that purity culture taught me about shame would just fly out of my head and I'd have sex every day and I'd love it. And that's not what happened. And so for me, there were also times in my marriage that I was somewhat taken advantage of. The trigger warning, when I was asleep. And so for me, it was just times when I just had absolutely no control over my body. Someone else was either telling me how to
Yeah.
use it or just using it for their own pleasure because I wasn't putting out enough for my entire life. And so for me, the first kind of motivator for getting back into this as a Wild Violet was just the fact that I knew there was interest in it and I needed to take control of my own income now as a single mom, battling this guy in court and all these things I was dealing with. Um, and and also as a way of reclaiming control over my own body and giving myself a voice to talk about, some of the things that had happened to me. And, you know, the difference between the ethical sex that I've had and what I experienced when I was married and didn't really know my own body at all. It I like that I can record what I want to record, what I'm interested in. I like that I get to provide an outlet for people to consume smut in a way that is respectful and ethical and beneficial to the creator. Um, I feel like that makes a difference because there are so many people in the world like my ex-husband. And what if, like we said, these ideas of modesty and stuff, they really trickle down. What if we could end up with a next generation that doesn't have such toxic views about all of this, and that that really has come to view a woman's body as her own. Porn has been around for a long time. It probably is going to be around for a long time. Um, I want to be part of moving the needle on this conversation and moving the world towards a more ethical porn world. I want to get out of the Hugh Hefner Pornhub era. Not that
Yeah,
everything on
definitely.
Pornhub is bad. We verified creators, but like there are plenty that we'll get into that someday.
Yeah.
So for me, whenever I create something that like I feel good about it, that's fun. Like I'm an artistic, creative person, and when I feel it, it makes me feel good about myself and more at home in my own body to watch myself like on camera to have to go back and edit these things. I get more and more comfortable, I think, with every inch of myself, which has been
Mhm.
great for my just knowing my own body, knowing myself. There's so much of this that there's so much I've learned. And then it's great experience in so many other areas. Editing and business management and just a million things. And
There's
it
so much that goes into it, like,
it really there really
yeah.
is. And like you said, I finally have really it's about consent. I finally have really clear boundaries where I'm able to say it's not shameful that you're attracted to me or other sex workers, whatever. It's not shameful for you to like look at me and get pleasure from that. That's okay. You don't have to be embarrassed. Here's how to do this respectfully, right? And like if you cross this boundary, then we're done here. And I have never in my life had the freedom and the license to say this far and no further. This is
Mhm.
the amount that you have to, this is what I'm worth. This is what you have to pay to access me. These are the standards by which we will communicate. This is like, never in my life have I gotten to look at myself and see myself as worthy of that kind of
Respect.
control over myself. Yeah, and respect,
Yeah.
autonomy. It's huge.
Autonomy, yeah.
It's really huge, and it feels definitely like a rebellion, moving out of the culture that I came from, and it feels like a really important thing to be doing and talking about, the way I'm just so grateful to it. I stumbled into to podcasting and the rest of this after some time doing the sex work, but it was always part of my work that I was talking about my deconversion and about the ethics and about providing a healthy outlet. And so now I'm just really grateful that it's kind of giving me a voice and giving me relationships, right? Where we can be having
Mhm.
these conversations. So
Yeah. And the two of us wouldn't have become friends if we weren't making porn. We've
that's
not made
true.
por we've not made porn together, but, like, we connected because we were
Yeah,
both creators, so yeah.
that's
Um,
right. We found each other through the
yeah,
Twitters, which has given me also so many gifts and
yeah.
friendships. And there's just a million
I
reasons that I appreciate the opportunity to have this kind of control over my own life and my own
yeah.
body and my own finances. And
I think we kind of just need to end this here today because I feel like it's on such a positive note that I
I'm
don't want to ruin that. I think that this is
totally with you.
probably where we need to end it.
Let's do it. I got to scuttle off to my next meeting anyway.
Thank you everyone for listening and supporting us in all of this. You can find us on Twitter. I'm at Transvangelical. Violet is at Wyld Violet with a Y. Um, by the time this drops, we don't know if we'll have a Patreon or something, but we probably will. So check out show notes and stuff and see what we might have because we're recording this before we have all that.
Yup. We're working. We're gonna hit the ground running, and we're so
Yep,
excited. So, yeah, like Alicia said, check your show notes, and we'll continue to try. We'll try to have more updates by the time we record our next episode for you. So,
perfect. Well, thank you.
thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.